Everything you know about the church and science is wrong. In this video, we will primarily be discussing the Catholic Church because the story of Galileo is what everybody thinks about when talking about religion and science. Typically, the church is depicted as anti-science. So, the church's relationship with science is much more complicated than simply being anti-science. Indeed, even since the 2nd century, in the days of early Christianity, it was already understood that the Bible could be figuratively interpreted. But the church at this time, and until the 11th century, was very disorganized, weak, and vague on many topics. All this began to change in 1049, when Pope Leo IX announced that the Pope would be elected by a council of cardinals, not appointed by the Byzantine emperor like it had been for centuries. To be sure, he was appointed, but he also had his cardinals vote for him before he accepted office. He introduced many changes which would become normal things in Catholic practice, like the fact that priests can't marry. But for our purposes, the moving of power from that of an emperor to a body of cardinals was significant, because it changed the church as an institution from one to be puppeted to one to be led, and it decided to be led by an educated class of theologians. For much of the early Middle Ages, from Clovis I to Otto I, the only literate people were clergymen, priests, bishops, and monks. Charlemagne, for his part, ordered the construction of many monasteries in his realm, monasteries which would be the sole source of books in Western Europe. Still, these precious strongholds of literary knowledge would dwarf the massive libraries of the Islamic world, like in Cordoba. Many European kings were in fact illiterate and relied on court bishops for written records. In fact, the only language other than Latin that was regularly written down was Anglo-Saxon. So when Leo IX made his changes in 1049, he transformed the church forever in a way that would complement the rise of urbanism in the 12th and 13th centuries and the changes that it would bring. Future popes and other religious leaders would take advantage of this. But first, the entire continent would militarize into a single holy cause. Of course, I'm talking about the Crusades. In 1096, the Byzantine Empire was being invaded by the Seljuk Turks, and it requested help from the West. Pope Urban II decided to do something new. He called a crusade. Instead of just helping Byzantium, he would retake the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and he declared that all Christians take part in this holy war will be forgiven of sin. The promise of both salvation and riches was just too great, and Europeans from across Christendom sailed to fight. The success of the First Crusade marked the European colonization of the Levant and a cultural exchange between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Many ancient Greek texts, like those of Aristotle and Hippocrates, were actually translated and preserved in Arabic, as the Byzantine emperor banned Aristotle, believing that it was too incompatible with Orthodox Christianity. So paradoxically, the Greeks were being studied in Arabic, not in Greek. To be sure, the transfer wasn't entirely one-sided. The heavy cavalry knights of Europe were new to the Berber and Turkmen tribes of the Fatimids and Seljuks, and they were readily adapted into Islamic warfare. A century later, the tides would turn as the legendary Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin, would take back the Holy Land. Europeans would respect this man as an honorable representation of chivalry, as he also adopted this heavy cavalry type of warfare. The Islamic world did study the Greeks for centuries before the Europeans would do so as intensively, and they were already noticing cracks in Greek thought. One such man was Al-Farabi, a physician who found that Hippocrates lacked evidence in some of his claims. This would foreshadow the issues the European scholars would find and the changes that they would make on how intellectual thought should be practiced at all. In the wake of the Crusades, Europe became more connected, and not just by having a slightly bigger library now. Commerce reopened between East and West, giving rise to a powerful merchant class in places like Italy and later the Netherlands. Guilds of skilled craftsmen would form in growing cities, monopolizing industries and acting as proto-unions for their members. Many cities were communes, given specific rights which placed them outside of the control of whichever lord ruled over the countryside. This led to the famous rule that if a serf escaped to a commune for 1 year and 1 day, he would become a free man. These communities were ruled by money, many of them oligarchies, and to climb the social ladder, you had to know how to make it. Arabic numerals made arithmetic easier, but literacy was still necessary to run larger business ventures. People began to seek new avenues of education. This would soon come. Long ago, Charlemagne declared that all monasteries and churches have primary schools, but in that day, that never came to fruition. In the meantime, many churches tried to raise funds for school teachers on their own, but in the 13th century, real change would occur. In the Fourth Lateran Council, a pope named Innocent III would install continent-wide changes. He was a young pope, entering office at just the age of 30, and he was filled with ambition. In fact, some say his reign was the height of papal power. And one of his goals was to drastically expand the church bureaucracy. It was declared that all churches have adjacent primary schools for boys, in the hopes that a more educated populace would be more hireable. This education, though, was open to everyone, not just aspiring clergymen. Many professions, for instance lawyers, would take advantage of this education before splitting off to form their own learning institutions. This time period also saw the rise of the university, the most famous of which being in Paris. And in the 12th century, it was led by a scholar named Peter Abelard. As the chairman of the University of Paris, he taught areas of higher learning, which included the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, astronomy, arithmetic, music, and geometry. These were called the liberal arts because they liberated you. Abelard's most famous work was Sec et Non, which is Latin for yes or no, and it was a list of contradictions in doctrine from the church authorities. Finally, he proposed that these can all be reconciled. But how would the church transform from obscurity and contradiction to reason and soundness? His pupil, Peter Lombard, did exactly that in his work Sentientiae, which means the sentences. And he did it using the scholastic method, a medieval university invention. Using dialectic, scholasticists read multiple texts and attempt to reconcile perceived contradictions. Of course, sometimes one side was clearly right, but other times supposed contradictions were completely subjective. Gone were the days of petty theology, which dominated Eastern Christianity, like when the Oriental Orthodox churches split from the Roman Church in the 4th century over disagreement of whether Jesus was wholly human and wholly divine, or partly human and partly divine. Seriously, that caused the whole church to split. The scholastic method wasn't the only change, dare I say, improvement in this era. Empiricism itself started here. Saint Anselm of Canterbury, in the 12th century, already proposed that faith should be a marriage between reason and revelation. This idea continued in the 13th century when Thomas Aquinas, leader of the University of Paris, wrote a series of foundational texts to Catholic philosophy. One such proposal was that God could be understood just as much through the study of the natural world as with prayer and studying the Bible. This conclusion would revolutionize the Catholic Church as an arbiter of science. In the 13th century, too, the scientific method was beginning to form. One polymath in England, Roger Bacon, wanted to conduct some experiments to test physical predictions of Aristotle. To his surprise, Aristotle was wrong. For 1,000 years, many predictions made by famous ancient Greeks were taken to be true without ever being tested, partially because of Plato's concept of perfect forms. Essentially, it led to the conclusion that all you can learn about the world can be figured out through reasoning in your mind alone. Roger Bacon discovered that this was not true. Empiricism was beginning to form, and the medieval proto-scientists began to conduct experiments for the first time. So by the time Nicholas Copernicus made his discoveries in the 16th century, that the Earth revolves around the Sun, Europe already had centuries of intellectual tradition, tying polymaths, clergymen, students, teachers, universities, and cathedrals into a massive web of discussion and discourse. When Copernicus first published his work, his biggest critic was Giovanni Maria Tolosani, a Dominican friar and astronomer himself. He had recently written a treatise calling for the reform of the calendar. His two main criticisms: firstly, that Copernicus had no explanation for the model he proposed. Secondly, he made his conclusion first and looked for evidence afterward. Sound familiar? It should. These are exactly the types of arguments that you might see on Our Atheism today. Regardless, Copernicus was never censored in his life, and he even devoted his work to the sitting pope. Oh, and when his discovery was made, Cardinal Nikolaus von Schönberg wrote him this letter. I hope you appreciate this German accent text-to-speech that I randomly found online to read this.
Some years ago word reached me concerning your proficiency, of which everybody constantly spoke. At that time I began to have a very high regard for you. For I had learned that you had not merely mastered the discoveries of the ancient astronomers uncommonly well but had also formulated a new cosmology. In it you maintain that the earth moves, that the sun occupies the lowest, and thus the central, place in the universe. Therefore with the utmost earnestness I entreat you, most learned sir, unless I inconvenience you, to communicate this discovery of yours to scholars, and at the earliest possible moment to send me your writings on the sphere of the universe together with the tables and whatever else you have that is relevant to this subject.
So then why, many years later, was Galileo Galilei punished for his Copernican views by the Church? It's difficult to know for certain, but in recent years it's been argued that this was done in response to the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's core three tenets of his movements, sola scriptura, sola gratia, and sola fide, meaning only scripture, only grace, and only faith, changed Western Christian theology forever. Sola scriptura commanded Christians to only rely on the Bible, and sola fide commanded to only use blind faith. The result was various interpretations of the natural world, which questioned whether the Church should continue its relationship with science. But in the 17th century, when it was clear that the Protestant Reformation couldn't be crushed completely, it's possible that the papacy attacked Galileo as a sort of compromise to prevent more people from becoming Protestant. I'd like to point out Galileo's specific punishment, house arrest. I think this is important because it's quite mild, and it was only placed on him after he ignored the first punishment, which was just censorship and nothing else. I'd like to compare this to Giordano Bruno, a contemporary of Galileo. He was a mystic, a hermetic occultist, and a practitioner of black magic. He built off of the Copernican model by proposing that the sun had multiple planets. But unlike Copernicus, this didn't come to him through experimentation but revelation. For his strange magical beliefs, the Church burned him at the stake. Today, Bruno is declared by atheists worldwide as a martyr of science, even though he never actually did any experiments, and he was punished for his strange mystical beliefs. So what am I getting at? The Church had no problem killing Bruno, as they had been dealing with strange mystical movements for centuries. But Galileo Galilei was clearly different. It supports the possibility that the Pope's censorship was done out of pragmatism, rather than some burning passion to hunt down evil science or whatnot. Over the centuries, as the wars of religion that ravaged Europe died down, scientific pursuit was once again alive and well in the Church. The Jesuits of the 17th and 18th centuries made contributions to the study of seismology. At the same time, the Anglican Archbishop James Ussher was using the Bible to calculate the Earth is just 6,000 years old, starting the young Earth creationist movement, which plagues the American education system to this day. As Charles Darwin was formulating his theory on natural selection, Catholic friar Gregor Mendel was using pea plants experiments to discover how inheritance works, 100 years before the discovery of DNA. The Church of England was still deciding whether to denounce Darwin or not. And in the early 20th century, Belgian priest Georges Lemercier formulated the mathematical calculations for the Big Bang Theory. as well as discovering Hubble law. It's clear then that the Church has had a long history of scientific pursuit. There is an illustration from a 13th century French codex. It depicts a god as the ultimate architect of the universe. For centuries, scholars of Europe toiled to understand this architecture in the hopes of getting closer to its maker. What we found has left us with mixed feelings. Some stare into the vast emptiness of space and see that there is nothing, and that they find this nothingness cruel. Yet still others look deeper, finding entirely new worlds, new architecture to study. This kind of journey may never end, and that's the exciting part. What's truly out there is uncertain, but one thing is for sure: it will never be nothing.